Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with George Winkler, and in a fascinating turn of events, you have decided that this will be a Favre-free zone for at least the next 5 minutes. Maybe we'll get to it at the end, right?
That's right, but then you just mentioned his name, so it's not a Favre-free zone anymore.
No, I hate paradoxes like that. Let's talk about some of the guys that you do want to highlight for this upcoming weekend, specifically guys that may not have been fantasy starters at the beginning of the season, but have kind of taken on new importance as the season has gone on. Let's start with Darren McFadden. I mean, I think it's not a stretch to say that he's been a bit of a disappointment thus far in his career.
Yeah, and injuries have been the main problem for that. He's missed 6 games over the last 3 years and 2 games this year, but he comes back last week, runs roughshod through the Broncos, and if this guy can stay healthy, we see what he can do last week.
Now, how do you see this playing out in Oakland for the Raiders? Obviously, they've got Michael Bush, who has proven himself to be at least competent as a running back. Do you think that McFadden, moving forward, is going to be the guy? Do you think he should be the guy? Is there any kind of complication that you see moving forward, other than the injuries, which, I mean, with McFadden, you do have to keep an eye on?
I think as long as this guy makes it between the lines on Sunday, he's the guy. And the interesting thing about Tom Cable is he tends to ride one running back, give him most of the carries.
He's going against the general trend of the running back by committee thing.
Yes, and go figure, the Raiders going against the general trend. They kind of march to their own drummer there. But, yeah, McFadden is the guy, and he's the guy going into this week. Of course, if you have him and you have Bush, you don't get rid of Bush, because he's your handcuff. And even if you have Bush and you don't have McFadden, you keep Bush too, because, you know, McFadden's had the injury problems. But this week's interesting because he goes against Seattle, which is number 2 against the run. And, you know, Seattle has a habit of stacking the box against the run. Their pass defense is very bad as a result. So I'm looking at McFadden this week and saying, you know, number 2 running back numbers is what I'm expecting from him. He'll get the carries, have a solid game, but, you know, last week was a special week. Okay,
so mentioning that they're going to be stacking the box, if you've got Raiders, Lewis Murphy, for instance, Zach Miller, are you expecting bigger games for them?
I'm expecting a bigger game for Zach Miller. I don't think that I can trust the Raiders receivers, wide receivers yet, and mainly that's because of their shaky quarterback play. It's tough for them to get the ball outside. Seattle did a similar thing with the 49ers in week 1 where they stacked against Frank Gore and dared Alex Smith to beat them, and he couldn't. So, and I think the similar things will happen with the Raiders this week.
Let's go to the deepest barrel of the deepest fantasy football barrel, as it were, and that's the wide receivers. Kenny Britt, I mean, was fantasy relevant last year. I forget if he was fantasy relevant the year before, but I may be mistaken on how many years he's been in the league. To me, at least, it feels like he's been around forever. I might just be hanging around too many Alabama fans. Thing is, Kenny Britt this year, he's actually very not bad in recent games, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's scored a touchdown in 5 straight games. He had 3 last week, and this is another guy like McFadden. When he's in the field, he's great, but obviously he's got some maturity issues off the field that he has to deal with. As long as he can stay out of trouble, stay out of bars, which he says he's going to do. I don't know if I believe him, but
I mean, I love that story, by the way. In case you had heard, Jeff Fisher heard that Britt got in a fight at a bar, or confrontation, whatever, went to the bar himself and started asking questions the next night. So I'm guessing that this happened on like a Friday night or something, and then Jeff Fisher, this bearded dude in his 50s, walking up, asking people questions. Have you seen this guy? What's going on? Knowing how little coaches sleep, I'm just wondering, how did Fisher even get the time to do this in the first place? That's crazy.
That is crazy, but I think it's an indication of what Fisher thinks of Britt. He thinks he has a special talent here, and you know he's been able to do it with Vince Young and Kerry Collins this year, and so that tells me something. That tells me that he can get it done. He has a tough matchup this week too. The first pass defense in the league against San Diego. Now, San Diego has faced some weak opponents, you know, Arizona with Max Hall.
And they are a befuddling team. I mean, because they've got good offense. Their defense, I mean, both the raw numbers and adjusted numbers that I've seen are pretty good, if not if not, if you don't feel optimistic about them moving forward, even though they're trending kind of downward. I mean, they started out very well. I've got to think that they're better than they've shown thus far, than the win-loss totals would indicate. Their special teams has been horrific. They do have a good defense. I mean, as you're pointing out, their corners, they're not terrible. Their linebackers, they're not terrible. Their pass rush, not terrible.
They're number one in offense. They're number one in defense. They're 2-5.
Yeah.
So something has to be going on there. I have to think they're not getting the running game involved as much as they should. And maybe people are seeing them as a one-dimensional team, and it's easier to defend. But I think Kenny Britt is still in my lineup this week, despite the tough matchup because of San Diego's weak opponents. I think, last week was the first one against New England when they shut down New England. So maybe Britt doesn't have a great game this week, but I think based on how hot he is, you have to keep him in your lineup.
All right, now let's talk about a guy who was higher on fantasy radars. I don't even know if that's the right analogy, but was definitely on the fantasy radar as a starter, potential wide receiver 1 at the beginning of the season, and that's Dwayne Bowe. He's going up against possibly the worst team in all of pro football this week.
He's going up against the Buffalo Bills, but here's the secret about them. They're 9th against the pass. And are they good against the pass? Maybe not. It could be because they're 32nd against the run and nobody bothers to pass against them. So, again, I'm a little bit skeptical of those numbers. I look at that matchup, Dwayne Bowe should be sitting. Maybe not. Maybe Buffalo hasn't been tested through the air, and maybe Dwayne Bowe can get it done. He's scored 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 games, taking advantage of bad pass defenses in Houston and Jacksonville. So, I actually feel a little bit more hesitant toward Bowe than Britt, though, this week. Okay. Because, of that, the Chiefs don't pass a lot, if they don't have to, maybe they do pound Buffalo this week.
I feel like that this leads into one of the questions that is at the heart of fantasy football, which is that there's a very stark difference between real life and fantasy and what you're trying to do. If we were running a football team and had the choice of taking our chances with Kenny Britt performing against the Chargers in real life, I don't think we'd take that chance because we'd be saying like, no, I want the easier matchup of our going up against the Bills. But in fantasy, Dwayne Bowe just might not get any chances simply because we know that the Chiefs have a pretty solid pair of running backs. They have a pretty solid offensive line, and Matt Castle, not exactly the greatest shakes in the world. They're going to run the ball and just destroy the Bills that way, run out the clock on them. Bowe's just not going to get any targets, I'm thinking. And that plays into the fantasy choice.
I mean, the hope is that the Bills can play like they did last week and take advantage of a weaker Chiefs pass defense, and Ryan Fitzpatrick can keep the game close where that they have to pass, the Chiefs have to pass, to Dwayne Bowe, or that Dwayne Bowe gets his scores early. Because if Kansas City goes up big early, then, you're going to see a lot of Thomas Jones, Jamal Charles late. And that's the thing that drives fantasy owners nuts every week, is trying to figure out how these games are going to play out.
Yeah, and let's not even get into the whole Thomas Jones, Jamal Charles thing. That still bothers me earlier in the season. George, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.